Cal State University, San Bernardino. This evening, Dr. Larimer will demonstrate how historical records and native testimonies provide very different perspectives from one another. In her book, Resurrecting the Past, the California Mission Myth, she traces the marginalization of Native American people within mission history and critiques the romanticized narrative that we all know today. Thank you, and will you welcome Dr. Larimer.
I feel like I should stand more in this middle, but we'll see how it goes. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to speak to all of you, and I'm so surprised at how many people are here. It's wonderful. One of the things that I really focus on in my research and in my book is looking at how we can find an authentic history of a place, and what really a true history of a place is. How can we identify the real lived experiences of people who lived in the mission system, when the common narrative that we see today when we visit most mission sites is focused primarily on the Spanish perspective and does little to give real life experiences of Native people real value. So one of the things that I want to talk about today is the ways that we can identify history that is more inclusive and ways to find more accurate representations of the past in sources. So the way that I usually like to start off is by looking at Native history of an area. So Native Californians lived in what we now call California for thousands of years. According to countless creation stories and oral histories, Native people have lived in California since the beginning of time, since time immemorial. Anthropologists can date this back to about 12,000 years ago, depending on different regions. But Native people can really locate their history to specific sites and places, to sites of creation in and around Temecula, for example, if you're familiar with the larger Inland Empire, for the Serrano people around Big Bear Lake, and for the Chumash people, the Channel Islands moving into Carpinteria, for an example. So Native people had and continue to have very deep and connected experiences with the land and with their history on the land. That history is, in most cases, overshadowed by the Spanish history that we know in California because of the way that this history was romanticized over the last 140 years or so. So we see that looking more closely. Here you can see some of the diversity that exists when we look at native housing, for example. Native people developed around their location into the environment that they thrived in. So you can see here Lake Como houses northwest of Sacramento. All these types of houses are built with different types of materials and are really specific to the types of environments that people lived in. Native people in California knew and continue to know their surroundings very well and have deep histories connected to that land. When we look more closely at the Temecula Valley and at the Luciño in particular, who spread from Oceanside into the Temecula Valley out towards Palomar Mountains and further beyond this valley, we can see that the Luiseño people's presence on the land is obvious for people who are looking. There are rocks that have grinding areas where people would be grinding acorns into the rocks. And so you can find this in Palomar Mountain State Park currently. But Native people generally in California didn't have the type of built environment that European and European American people viewed as developed. So they didn't have brick and mortar houses that were permanent and stayed for decades maybe, but for years and years. They, in most places, would move sometimes seasonally for food and based on weather patterns for better access to food and more comfortability. But we have this great knowledge of how Native people lived in California history in the past and how they continue to exist in the present. Yet when we look at narratives of the California missions, we don't actually see this continuation into the present in most cases. Instead, when we look at California history, for those of you who grew up in California or raised children in California or grandchildren in California, you may know that many schools in California for a long time have done the Mission Project, where students will build a mission, and the history around early California focuses primarily on the institutional site history of early Spanish colonial outposts, which were the missions here in California. And that mission history tends to really exclude Native perspectives in most cases, or a real thoughtful understanding of Native people. Because I know that so many people are from different backgrounds here, I'm just going to start off basically with what mission history is. So I apologize for those of you who know a lot, but here's some background for those of you who don't know too much. So the major center of the Spanish Empire in what they termed New Spain, in what was the Americas based in Central America in Mexico, was really the heart of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, and where they made a majority of their wealth using silver and gold mines in particular. Other European empires began to show interest in what we now know as California and the Pacific Coast in the late 1700s, in the mid-1700s. And so the Spanish wanted to protect their empire in what was Mexico, and a claim that they had previously established to the California coast. So they laid a plan to create a series of colonial outposts. Missions would be one aspect of this, which was part of a longer Spanish tradition of using missions to bring Native people from outside villages into a single place, to congregate them and instruct them in Catholicism, and then use them as laborers for the work that needed to be done. So the Spanish used this system of developing missions in what they called Alta California. So we had Baja California already established. Alta California is Northern California, and it just kind of extended inland into an undetermined place. So they used mission sites, these churches where they would congregate Native people, as the center point of this colonization or expansion into Alta California. Along with that, they used presidios, which is where the soldiers were stationed. They also had pueblos, where towns, of course, where settlers hopefully would develop into a larger population to help occupy Alta California from foreigners coming in. Foreigners meaning the Russians and British, who had been traveling along the California coast and in the northwest. So really the missions, the presidios, the pueblos were meant to establish an economic, self-sufficient system in California where the Spanish could occupy the land, use native people primarily as laborers, and through all of that, maintain a hold on their empire, and not risk having it threatened by people, by the Russians, by the British moving south. So what the Spanish did was they established over time a series of missions. The first one in San Diego in 1769, the next one in Monterey to establish a northern point and a southern point. And then over time they filled in the area in between. So we have missions like San Gabriel, San Antonio de Padua, and then through that in between we have more missions coming in. San Juan Capistrano, San Luis Rey, Santa Barbara, missions that mostly followed along the coast to show that the Spanish had a presence in California in case other foreigners were traveling along the coast. They could see. Here are presidios, soldier garrisons. Here are our missions where native people are working. So native people really were the major labor force. And the Spanish needed native people because the settler population in California was quite low. The overland trail bringing people from Mexico into California was closed down because of uprising among the Mojave and the Quechan people along the Colorado. And so there wasn't the travel coming up, bringing new settlers in. Pretty much just sea routes were available to bring new people into California for much of this early Spanish history. So again, they relied on native people to do a majority of the work within the missions. And you can see that in this first image and in the second image. Most of the missions, unlike the ones we see today, were very rural. They relied on ranching, agricultural production. They provide all of the food for the missionaries in California, for the soldiers, and for the missionized native people, what they call neophytes, those people who had been baptized and joined the mission community. You can see in these images, and have many of you been to missions in California, San Juan Capistrano or San Gabriel or San Diego? Many of them today are in the middle of very developed areas. And so it's hard to get a true sense of what these places existed like before they became tourist attractions and romanticized through the history that I'll talk about in a little bit. But I just want to lay this framework of what the missions were and what they did. Through establishing the missions, the Spanish brought in hundreds of heads of cattle, sheep, horses that thrived on the land in California. And so by the 1830s, there were hundreds of thousands of these grazing animals that spread throughout California. And these animals, of course, then ate native people's foods. They fouled waterways. They trampled what food they didn't eat. And so as a result of Spanish contact and bringing in this livestock, we see the native population in California drop significantly through malnutrition and starvation, in looking at food as one side of this. The Spanish also brought in diseases that native people hadn't been exposed to. So we see things like smallpox, cholera, influenza, pneumonia, but also venereal diseases like syphilis, which were spread more by just basic human contact and touch, or through objects that people touched that had been infected. And these things killed native people in great numbers as well. So we see native people turning to mission sites as places where they can find food in a stable manner, and also places where they can try to protect themselves from these diseases that are ravaging their communities. And also many native people turn to missions as places where they could escape some of the violence that soldiers were bringing into their communities, as Spanish soldiers would come in and abuse native people, in some cases quite harshly, and then also as places where hopefully the priests could protect them from further abuses. So they're complex sites on many levels, as you can see. But part of coming into mission communities was that Native people, once they're baptized at most missions, were supposed to not leave the missions. So baptism itself is considered a contract that binds Native people to mission sites. It varies really mission by mission, but this is the way to keep that labor force that they need to make these self-sustaining sites. At the same time, Native people witnessing that the death and disease that they had experienced outside of the missions continues on within mission communities, try to flee. So there's a lot of resistance and many movements to become what the technical term is fugitivism, which is too many vowels really for one word. But they become fugitives for the mission. It's because they want to escape the death and disease that they thought they could protect themselves from outside the missions is even worse. And we know all of this because many of the Spanish priests wrote about it in their journals or in letters. They kept very good records. So one of the issues that we encounter when we look at Spanish mission history is we have documents that spell out exactly what happened in many of the missions, the types of abuses that Native people faced from, both in some more rare cases from missionaries themselves, but also from the Spanish soldiers. They talk about the extreme amount of disease that Native people face once they become members of the mission community. One of the fathers from, I believe it's San Antonio de Padua, talks about Native people becoming part of the missions, and once they do, they tend to fatten, sicken, and die because they can't sustain this life on new food that their stomachs can't handle very well, but also the diseases that they're encountering, beyond the types of psychological stress that coming into a new society and not being allowed to leave would place upon a person. So at the very least, they are complex sites that many Native people had negative experiences with. And that is the general mission history that most scholars agree upon. But that's not the type of history that we see when we visit mission sites. Instead, we see a myth of the California missions that is really based in early American history and working to promote California as a region that Americans, primarily wealthy retirees, would want to come to. A region where a European history exists that predates even the United States of America. And that's what some of these authors that I will talk about write about and promote. That Spanish history in California is actually one of the beginning sites of European history that can counter early British history on the East. And we can look at the California missions by the late 1800s, which are in ruins at that point, as sites that are reminiscent of this early colonial history in California that European Americans can look back to as a shared history, and one that is reflective of a broader European past, and one that through the archways at some of the missions that you'll see in other images is reflective of even a further back past, even to Roman style architecture that many people can relate to as something idyllic, a society that was more democratic, more peaceful. They use all types of language to make this history something worth coveting and rebuilding. At the same time, Native people in California by the late 1800s had been in many places pushed off their land, facing a lot of the same destruction and devastating forces that had begun with the missions, but through various changes of populations. So at the beginning of Spanish colonization or Spanish contact in California, the population of Native people was around 310,000. Some people argue that it was high as 1 million. By the end of the Spanish period, when Mexico won its independence from Spain in 1821, and then over the next decade they began to slowly secularize the missions, turning them into parish churches, freeing Native people from their bound structure at the missions, and opening up the land to wealthy citizens like soldiers, military officials, the people who became the ranchers and rancheros in California during the Rancho period. The Native population by then, by the 1830s, was approximately 150,000. So that decline was primarily from malnutrition, starvation, diseases, and violence. So that's 1830. The Mexican government secularizes the missions. Much of the land in California that had been controlled by the missions and by missionaries is turned into private hands. And those private individuals use Native people as labor force on their ranchos. They aren't bound necessarily to the ranchos, but they're the labor force. They use the skills that they had used in the missions on the ranches to continue to survive within this new economic system. Other Native people moved into towns like Los Angeles or San Diego, and they found jobs. Some people tried to pass as Mexican so that they could protect themselves from laws that barred Native people from being in towns without papers to show that they could work. This is the 1850 Act for the Governance and Protection of Indians. Many of you are familiar with it. And by the 1840s, we see the beginning of the gold rush and American farming families before that moving into California and establishing farms and places, displacing some Native people. But that displacement really doesn't happen in large part until the gold rush. In the 1850s and 1860s, extreme violence decimates Native populations, especially in the north, but people traveled into California along southern routes, so they would come in towards Los Angeles and then travel up. And so we have Native people being displaced by this contact throughout California. So by 1900, the Native population is approximately 17,000 as a result of all of this contact. So that's just to place into context what's happening here. So we go from 310,000 upwards to 1 million people in 1769, down to 17,000 by 1900. And again, during that American period, from the 1850s to 1860s in particular, that's primarily violence, not as much death and disease. We can get into that more some other time, but there's a lot there if you're unfamiliar with Gold Rush history. But within this context then, many people view Native Americans as a vanishing group. Their population has declined significantly. So in fact, if you look at them numbers-wise, their population is vanishing, intentionally for the most part. The first governor of California in 1850 says that there's a war of extermination between Native people and us. So Americans need to be ready for this, and they need to be able to be prepared to counteract this war of extermination, or to be on the front side of it. So that's one of the reasons why we see Native populations drop so significantly. So by 1900, by the late 1800s, Native people in California really are a small number. At the same time, Americans are moving more and more into California, and they're looking to again, find this history that they can connect with. And the missions represent that history for some of these people. What's very interesting is that they use Native people as relics of this past that existed. Here's a Jacinto Serrano, a basket maker who's 90 years old from San Gabriel Mission. And they use them almost as pieces in an exhibition and put them on display. On the other side of it, this is also a way for Native people to make money within this economy that has changed quite significantly. But we have people like this and photographs that become postcards in some cases that represent this shifting history. Native people as fading into the past, as relics of this old Spanish time, who are, according to many writers at the time, incapable of assimilating into more modern culture. So, as the missions are in ruins, so are Native people. And because, according to some anthropologists at the time, Native people are unable to adapt to modern culture, they are also going to fade into the past as the mission ruins are. Some reformers argue that Native people can survive if they let go of their culture. The human aspect of them can move on into the present. And so there's an interesting correlation that happens with the treatment of Native people as I guess, bodies, as humans who can move into the future without their culture, and the type of whitewashing that we see with the missions as sites that can move into the future but changed, really separated from their past. So now we can talk about some of these myth makers and why they made this history in the first place. Are any of you familiar with Charles Loomis, founder of the Southwest Museum, a traveler and booster extraordinaire of California? Charles Loomis walked to California from Cincinnati under contract with the Los Angeles Times to send dispatches in along the way about his travels. And when he came, especially through the Southwest, he gained a strong sense of belonging and appreciation for Native peoples. He came into California working for the Los Angeles Times, but over time became a city librarian for Los Angeles and a prominent booster or promoter of Southern California itself and the greater Southwest as well. So Charles Loomis was this transplant from the East Coast who had attended Harvard but did not graduate, had I think what people say is a mental breakdown of some sort, and began to push back against that history. Didn't want to relate himself to that Anglo-European, English-based history, and instead fell in love with the Southwest and the Spanish history in the Southwest. But most Americans at this time had a negative perception of the Spanish history. They viewed the Spanish as these brutal conquistadors who had come in and obliterated native populations, and this is what we call the Spanish Black Legend, where the Spanish were these brutal colonizers and did really nothing to develop a very rich land in California. They should have had more developed colonies here, but did nothing. And some Americans argue that's because they were culturally inferior and could not do it. They needed the industrious English to do something like that. There's a lot of tug and pull between these two about who's better, English heritage and Spanish heritage. Charles Loomis comes in and says, we're viewing this wrong. What we see happening, and other scholars at the time also argue, is that the empire that we see in Mexico and what's happening in California is just an extension So California wasn't meant to be this developed place. It was meant to hold the land. And so it did a good job. The missions accomplished their goal in maintaining California from foreigners coming in and claiming California. So Charles Loomis then tries to create what is this white legend of Spanish colonization, that the Spanish were these benevolent missionaries and explorers who came in and extended developed civilization and proper culture to native populations, and created these wonderful mission sites where native people could be brought up a level in their standard of civilization. This is the language that they are using and the frame of mind that they're using. At the same time, Charles Loomis and other people like him, amateur anthropologists and archaeologists, are going around the Southwest and California, and they're collecting objects from native communities. They're buying baskets, or they're stealing baskets and blankets, pottery. You can see here some of Charles Loomis's collection, which becomes the founding collection of the Southwest Museum. Taking photographs of native people. At the same time, they're recording, Charles Loomis himself recording histories, recording songs, but also some are digging up graves and taking sacred objects, and they're displaying human remains in these cases. You can't see it too well, but there's some skulls in the front here. And all of this is meant to represent this vanishing Indian culture that people argue is going to fade into the past, that is a part of history and is not continuing on into the present. So then the missions themselves don't focus on that vanishing native history. They focus on the white legend narrative that Charles Loomis and others like him are trying to promote, that the Spanish came to California and did a positive good rather than harmed native communities. Helen Hunt Jackson is another figure that's prominent in this narrative. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Helen Hunt Jackson. Helen Hunt Jackson was an advocate for Indian rights and tried to improve the conditions of native people, especially in California, as a special commissioner. She traveled to many reservations in Southern California and helped petition for the establishment and land protection for native people in different regions. So she was very active in trying to help native people in the condition where they were currently at in the early 1900s, in the late 1800s. She died in the late 1800s. But through her writing and through her research with the people that she was staying with, primarily some of these old California families, she also then developed this romantic view of the Spanish past in California. She wrote this into her important book. I brought my copy here. I was going to pass it around, but I realized some of the pages are falling out, so you can just come see it. It's a really early copy of Ramona. It's printed in 1885, so wow. I think it's like first or second print or something. So you can look at it, but the pages are falling out. You need to get it rebound. So to try to increase this view of Native people as a group that needs to be helped in California, but one that is harmed more by American contact, she argues, than by Spanish contact or by the Mexican period. She writes this book, Ramona, where a half Native, half Scots Irish girl marries a Native man from Temecula and a Luiseño man, and they encounter a series of problems in their relationship. And in reading some of Helen Hunt Jackson's writings, she would write in her correspondence that she was trying to really pull on the heartstrings of Americans to do something about the contemporary issues in Native communities, but she had to bury the Indian story in the love story because she knew that Americans would not grab a hold of the Indian story aspect of it. They wouldn't read it if it was just a native story. So she buried it in this really romantic story that captured California as this picturesque landscape where the air itself could heal people. It's part of the story. And that's what people grabbed onto. At the same time, railroads are beginning to span throughout California and throughout the United States. And so Americans are traveling into California with Ramona in hand. Maybe this copy was one of them, maybe not. And they're traveling and touring the different places where Ramona could have lived or could have been. So if you've been to Old Town San Diego, there are Ramona sites there. There are Ramona sites throughout Southern California where they claim Ramona's buried, where she was married. I think those are in Old Town San Diego, right? And so this Ramona history helps romanticize the missions as these sites where history and life was much calmer and easier, and then Americans came in and really destroyed the way of life for Native people in California. John Stephen McGorty takes this to another level in his creation of the mission play. So while Helen Hunt Jackson is herself a reformer and somebody who's trying to improve the life for Native people, John Stephen McGorty and other writers like him were primarily authors, regional boosters. He wrote a history of California and several books on California, but his most well-known work, I think, is the Mission Play, which was performed thousands of times from 1911 into the 1930s. They recently reworked the Mission Play probably about 3 years ago and had another performance of it from a different perspective. But the Mission Play itself really exemplifies this history of California where Native people had lived, but quickly, once the Spanish arrived, fade into the background. And the Spanish establish these sites of civilization where Native people are brought up in a positive way, exposed to Spanish culture and life, taught how to work, and then it's just very romantic. It's 3 hours, I think, maybe more. It has flamenco dancers. The most recent one I saw also had some sort of Chinese dancers in it as well. I think as an ode to the San Gabriel's Chinese population. Very interesting, multicultural. But it's not based in history. In the most basic aspects of history, you can see where the story comes from. But the president at the time writes, I think it's President Hoover, writes to John Stephen McGorty on his 3000th performance and says, "Thank you for teaching California history to millions of Americans who hadn't been exposed to this romantic past before," saying that Americans can see the real lived experiences of the past by watching the Mission Play, when in fact it is a distorted view of the past that romanticizes California history beyond anything recognizable and excludes Native people greatly from that past. At the end of the play, Senora Yorba, who's the matriarch of the rancho where it's sat, and Ubaldo, the native ranch hand, talk about the end of the mission period during this Mexican secularization stage, where the missions are being taken over by private individuals, and they argue and discuss, and Senora Yorba says, well, hopefully one day someone will see these relics and work to restore them to their once glorified past. And that happens in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Charles Lomas establishes the Landmarks Club with the goal of preserving the missions and restoring the sites. Most of the sites had been ransacked. The people had taken their roof tiles to put on their barns or their own houses in the 1820s and 1830s. And the missions themselves are made out of adobe. So when adobe is exposed to the natural elements, it deteriorates. It's mud and hay and it's baked clay bricks. So most of the missions were really in ruins. You could see some of the archways, but most of the architecture wasn't there. So Charles Loomis and the group of promoters and local boosters that he puts together with the Landmarks Club work to raise money so that they can revitalize these mission sites. And they start with San Juan Capistrano as the site to begin restoration work and rebuilding. And so we see throughout California missions being rebuilt by various groups, one at a time, and not even on their original footprint, and not even in the original way that they looked. So most of the missions we see today aren't the original, they're not the original structures, they're not on the original footprint, and they don't include many aspects of the mission sites themselves. One of the exceptions is Mission La Purísima, which during the 1930s, the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Great Depression did historical research to rebuild and reconstruct in a historically accurate way. It's an interesting tidbit. But this mission history that we have, where now tourists are using automobiles, you can see here in the foreground, to travel to these sites as these places where people could pass time in a slower, more relaxed way than the modern hustle and bustle of the late 1800s and early 1900s, which they actually said, things are becoming too modern. We need to slow down and go to these sites where life was slower and calmer. So they argued about people even using cars to get to the mission sites. There's some promotional material where they argued that people should ride bicycles instead of these noisy cars. But this history is removed from the current condition of native people here. So here we have some native people at the Temecula village. This is the actual caption from the photo. So it's just the Temecula Village Indians in Pachanga Canyon in the early 1900s. And so you see that native people at this point had been extremely marginalized, viewed as a vanishing group. Their history is not represented in mission sites where hundreds of thousands were impacted over time, not just directly from being baptized, but also through trade networks that spanned throughout California. So those diseases spread throughout California, hundreds of thousands of people were impacted. So you can see the different views of this romantic history versus the lived reality of the people at the time. But we know that this history is much more complicated, and that native people, rather than being these passive groups who were just acted upon within the missions, were instead very active participants in their lived experiences. For example, the Kumeyaay in San Diego were very forceful against the Spanish from the beginning. As soon as Spanish ships arrived and Spanish soldiers had created camps in Kumeyaay territory, groups of Kumeyaay people had attacked Spanish settlements. This is an image of the 1775 Kumeyaay revolt, with the epitome of the revolt is the murder of Father Luis Jaime, whose body is so badly beaten and face smashed in with a rock that as scholars we look at it and say these people had a very serious rock to grind against the Spanish here. There was some very serious anger that the Kumeyaay had, and these people in particular, against the Spanish presence here. They burned this mission to the ground. It was not one of these adobe missions. It was an earlier mission that was able to burn much easier. And they pushed the Spanish out and stopped the construction of Mission San Juan Capistrano for quite some time because of this attack. But from the the Spanish perspective, or from the boosters' perspective, what we see is that this is referred to as the martyrdom of Father Heinrichs. And it's discussed in that sense, rather than why would Native people be so frustrated with his presence? What led to this attack? It had been months in the planning, and was a result really of some violence against Native people that was retribution between the soldiers. It's complex, and I don't want to get into the details of it, but I write about it more. There's many people who write about it. But this is a history that is very complex, and where Native people resisted, not just by outright rebellions, but Native people poisoned priests. They killed them in other missions as well. But on more basic levels, they worked slower to show their discontent for the Spanish. They left the missions to show their discontent for what was happening. On the other side, though, we also can see ways where the Spanish missions were not as benevolent as presented in some cases. So this is an interesting image. It's a coloring book that I think I bought at Mission San Francisco, Mission Dolores. It's the one in San Francisco on the Mission District. And here you can see this woman with stockades on her feet, with stocks on her feet, as a way of being punished. Because if women left the area, tried to escape the Monterios that they were forced to live in, divided from their families, the young women were forced to live in Monterios, separated from their families as a way to protect them. But these places were really filled with diseases because they were so close together at most places. But here you can see one of the punishments. Also, there was a lot of punishments like whippings. 25 lashings was considered minor to moderate as a punishment. But these are things that aren't discussed, which is difficult to do if you're trying to romanticize a history. But we really should look at all aspects of the history before concluding about the accurate aspects of it. So the missions at the time of their romanticization looked more like this first image. Mostly in ruins. Much of the sections had no roof tiles. The adobe had been deteriorating. Many had been abandoned for quite some time or reused during the U.S.-Mexican War as barracks for soldiers. Some had been remade into saloons. All kinds of different things. Some remained in the church hands. But here you can see the interior courtyard of Mission San Juan Capistrano in 1896. Around the time when Charles Loomis looks at this as a place that should be restored and remodeled. And then here you have in the 2010s the interior courtyard, which many now who visit missions are filled with rose gardens, have fountains, are these peaceful places that these boosters intended for them to be, where people can go and escape the hustle and bustle of life. So it gives this false pretense that these were sites that Native people also viewed as calming, as escapes, as places where their people thrived. And we know that that's not the case. That mission history was very negative for most Native people. And Native people were the ones who were the most impacted by mission history. So in looking at the California missions, it's very important to recognize that California mission history is, to many Native people, not in the past. That this history, because of the way that it is presented and misrepresented, is something that is still lived by many Native people. When I give these talks at places like the California Indian Conference, it's not uncommon for people to cry in the audience after because of the real felt pain that they have through this historical trauma that's been continued over generations. That started here with contact from the Spanish and continued on through Mexican and American periods in California history, and then through this revised past seems to continually resurface as they have to readdress, is the history that I know about my people true and accurate, or is this history the true and accurate history, the romanticized history? So it's just one way of addressing those questions. How do we know what history is true and accurate? So the most popular history always the closest to the truth, or is something else happening underneath that? So, thank you. I have no idea what time it is.
You know, thank you so much. And I think we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Okay.
So if you're willing to entertain the questions.
Yeah.
And then I'll kind of time things,
Okay.
and then we'll close the meeting, and then you'll be back at the book table, and if people want to engage you back there, okay?
Yeah.
So about 10 more minutes. Thank you.
Yeah.
In terms of treatment for those who were baptized in and who were forced to labor, how did the conditions compare to those who were in slavery?
So you have to stand up and
How
project.
were the conditions different from those who were baptized into the missions
Yeah.
and those who were enslaved?
Yeah, in American history. How would you
In American history. Well, that's a really difficult question to get at, and it's one that scholars argue about quite a bit, because some people argue that within the missions, Native people were slaves. And when I, especially when I give this talk to largely Native audiences, that comes up quite a bit, that Native people were enslaved in the missions. They could not leave. They had no choice about their daily life. It was very structured and regimented. They didn't really necessarily choose what they ate. But each mission was very, very different. So to generalize and say that all experiences were like that is not correct. Every mission was very different depending on the priest that was there. I guess when we look at coerced labor, so labor that is somewhat forced in a way, it's different than American slavery. In that American slavery, we're looking at chattel slavery, first of all, where people are bought and sold, and it's a much more stringent system. And within the missions, and they're working, it's typically gang labor, maybe plantations. The missions themselves, the work was quite diverse. So Native people would be working in fields, in the ranchos. Women would be working typically more domestic roles, because part of the mission community is to also acculturate them into Spanish values. So women would be doing much more domestic roles inside the mission communities. Men would be working outside the missions in fields, in the ranches, for example, with the livestock. So I think that part of the difference that you could see is that with American slavery, I don't think education and conversion to a religion was not part of that system. Whereas with the Spanish missions, educating Native people in the Spanish way and conversion was a central part of what the mission goal was. So when we look at the labor itself, it's pretty difficult, but I think that there are some cultural differences that we can see. And of course, this varies across every mission. So at some missions, Native people did not live there. San Luis Rey, they had a smaller Indian village. Most Native people lived outside of the missions. So then we wouldn't look at that the same way. They had much more freedom outside of the missions. And that's one of the reasons why some Los Inyo people say that the population survived in much greater numbers than at other missions, because the population wasn't so restricted to the mission grounds where they died in much larger numbers. So it varies. Yeah. That's a good answer. Yes? So the mission play, I think, went on into around the 1940s-ish, and then it occasionally is redone. The The most recent reproduction was more a revisioning, I think they called it. So it's not, it was based in the original mission play, the general storyline, but they worked closely with the Tongva Gabrielino people of Los Angeles to make sure that that Tongva Gabrielino story was told. So it's based on the original story, but different. And I only think they did a handful of performances. So there was a producer, and I think he was the playwright and helped directed it. And he did the mission play revision, and he also did a Toy Purina play, who's this resistance figure in mission history for the San Gabriel mission. So I think you can see clips of it online on YouTube. They have some of the mission play. So it's based around these teenagers who are brought back in time to mission days, and they have various perspectives, and they each interject those perspectives. Well, I thought the missions were nice, and Native people liked it. Well, I thought they were places of death and destruction. So let's see what actually happens, and then they play out a scene. And then they go back to the teenagers and get that view, and then they play out more scenes. But they bring in Tongva Gabrielino people to interact with that history as well. It was very nicely done. Yes?
Wasn't there quite a bit of intermarriage with the Indians and say the Spaniards? And we were up at San Antonio de Padua once, and some people that still live in the area trace back to a great grandmother that married a Spanish soldier. So was that fairly common? Or?
Yeah, there was a common intermarriage between Native people and Spanish soldiers. Toy Purina, for example, who was one of these people who was viewed as a responsible party or a participatory party for this revolt at Mission San Gabriel, as a part of her apology for it, or punishment also, she was baptized, renamed Regina, and then moved north and married a soldier and had children with a Spanish soldier. Because we see that most of the soldiers who are coming in were coming without their families. So that intermixing would be something that would be common.
And so, in other words, maybe the population figures, are they talking just the pure Indians, like the 17,000? Or do they try to consider those that are maybe mixed with American?
Right, the population figures are something that's actually pretty hard to get at because there's no consensus. There's no census at the time, so they're not handing out.
So instead of maybe everybody dying off, they kind of merge with other groups.
Well, yeah, part of what's happening is I think that one of the ways that they estimate population is by looking at village sizes, and so the sizes of the villages are just no longer there. They're decimated, and a lot of that is through disease. And one of the ways that we can see that is through the baptismal records and the death records at the mission. So approximately 81,000 people were baptized in the missions, and approximately 60,000 died within the missions. So just with those figures, you can see the death rate is pretty extreme. But also what we see happen, especially into the American period, is people who maybe are fully Native are identifying themselves as Mexican and trying to pass as Mexican or Hispanic because it is much safer to be Hispanic or Mexican in California at the time than it is to be Native. In some places in Northern California, there's a bounty for Native scalps and ears. So people get reimbursed by the county for bringing these things in this war of extermination that I mentioned. In Southern California, like I mentioned, and throughout California, there's the 1850 Act for the Governance and Protection of Indians. And part of that is allowing Americans to take Native children as apprentices into their homes, and they can keep them as apprentices, essentially servants, into their 20s. So if you are not identifying as Native, then you can protect your children. That's more for Native people who are living, I think, in village sites in a more traditional way. But within cities as well, Native people had to have papers to show that they were allowed to work within cities. So this is also a way to assimilate more into to society and to circumvent some of those laws and to be able to sustain yourself economically within those systems. The Gamberley and Otongo are another good example here. That an anthropologist at the time, very prominent anthropologist, Alfred Kroeber, argued that the Gamberley and Otongo people did not need a reservation, and there's not a reservation for them in Los Angeles. There's no reservation in Los Angeles County, but they don't have a reservation because he argued that they were friendly Native people. They had assimilated into the society, and they were positively contributing to Los Angeles. And so because of that, they did not need a reservation to keep them separate from the American population there. At the time, it would have helped them to have a land base, but now, even more today, it would have been more important for them to have that protection. So we see issues there with assimilation or with staying separate. Yes.
I'm not sure exactly how to put this one, because it didn't happen, but in the early Spanish period, was put a commitment, I don't know how serious, to turning the native land, traditional lands to
Oh, I can't hear the end of you.
Stand up and speak loudly.
I understand. I understand that some period early in Spanish, in the mission period, that there was a commitment to return the Spanish tradition lands to the Native people. Obviously, it didn't happen, but was that part of their original plan?
Yeah, part of the mission system at the beginning is that the missions would not be permanent. That they were these temporary institutions where the Spanish would instruct Native people in Catholicism and in proper ways to work the land, and then Native people could then take over that land after a period of 10 years. So there was this 10-year instructional period established as part of the mission system, but when we read the letters of missionaries, they constantly say Native people aren't ready yet. They're not ready yet. They're like children. No matter what we do, we have to constantly reteach them. They don't stop speaking their language. They're practicing their cultures secretly. They aren't fully assimilating in the ways that we would want them to. So they would continually extend this instruction period until by the 1830s, with the end of Spanish missions, with Mexican secularization, the Mexican government ends the mission period. It says that the land should be turned over to Native people. That's part of secularization. And that all remaining lands will go to private individuals to try to improve the amount of colonization in California from people from Mexico, hopefully. But most people don't come. We see large landowners grabbing huge tracts of land and taking much of the herbs from the missions. But there are cases where Native people did get land grants. There's a prominent one from Mission San Luis Rey who does get a land grant and is able to hold on to it for quite some time. And I think it becomes part of one of the ranchos. It's been a little bit since I've read it. Yes. Okay.